Well, how the story goes is that my adoptive father and mother lived in Korea. They were in their early 20s, and they were there they were being English teachers. And my dad also worked for the adoption agency, which is no longer around. But he got a phone call one day and from the adoption agency, and they said that you have to go to Moonsan to get all of the babies out of this orphanage that was very dilapidated. And so when he showed up, he took all the babies out and he put them all into the car. And as he describes the place, it was extremely dilapidated. There was rats and mice running around. All of us were in cribs. And From the sounds of it, it sounds like maybe a bunch of us were crying. We were very malnourished. And so my dad, when he took all the babies out, there was one baby left and there was no more room in the car. And of course, this was before car seats. And so he couldn't leave that one baby behind. And it was me. And so he wrapped it up in, or it was, I was wrapped up in a blanket. And so he didn't even know what I looked like. And so he sat me down on his lap and he opened up the blanket because he decided, okay, if this little baby's going to sit on my lap, I want to know what they look like. And so he opened up the blanket and he said that I had the biggest grin on my face. And then I reached up and I grabbed his nose and he started laughing and then I peed on his lap. So that's where my story starts. There's been some thought that maybe my birth mother dropped me off there at Christmas Eve, and that I was at the orphanage for about 6 months. And when my parents got me, they said that I had dead lice in my hair. I was extremely malnourished. I had scabies, bites everywhere. Yeah, I was very unhealthy, and so they took me home. I think my dad took me to the hospital first, with all the rest of the babies to make sure that we were, you know, getting the medical attention that we needed. And so about a month later, I think, is when they took me home and when they were living in Korea. And my mom was already 6 months pregnant. And so my mom, she didn't want at first, she wasn't sure. I can't say she didn't want, but she wasn't sure if she wanted to adopt me because, first of all, um, living in Korea, a new country, she had no idea, what was going on. And being 6 months pregnant and already going to be a new mother. And then my dad wants to bring home a toddler, I mean, it just, so I was about a year and a half years old then. And so she was fairly nervous about it, but my dad surprised her with me at the hospital. And she started bawling and she said that, yeah, you're right. She is our daughter and we have to have her. And so they brought me home and they said that when they fed me, the first night that it was horrible because they fed me and then I cried and I cried and I cried for like an hour, they said, nonstop. And they couldn't figure out. And they said that they never regretted taking me, but they weren't sure of their capabilities of being parents at that point. They were like, oh no, but then they figured out that I was just hungry, that I hadn't eaten, hardly anything because I still had the malnourished protrude belly and everything. I mean, I was still not a very healthy kid and I couldn't move around. They said that I could lay only on my back. And so I didn't know how to roll over. I didn't know how to sit up. I just laid there and smiled, and that was it. And so they said, though, after a month of being with them, that I was up running around. I was talking Korean to the Koreans and talking, English to the Americans. I mean, it was, a really fast recovery once I got the right nourishment and attention and love that I needed, I guess. Um, so yeah, and we lived there for about 3 years, and, my name, Younghwa, was given to me by the orphanage, is what they said, and my parents decided to keep it. They didn't wanna give me an American name because they didn't know how long they were gonna be in Korea, and they didn't want me to be, stick out like a sore thumb, which is kind of funny because here, they give us all, American names, and, because they don't want us to stick out, And so, but my mom gave me her name as my middle name, Young Ann, just in case if, we did go back to the US, that if I wanted to change it. And I never did. I kept it. Well, yeah, at one point I did want to change it. I wanted to change it to Connie because of Connie Chung, the only Asian woman that I knew, that I saw that was, a public figure. But thank goodness I didn't change it. But anyway, so I have little spurts of memories of Korea, but not much during that time. Throughout the years that we have gone back, I've lived all over the world. My parents love to travel, and I've lived in 6 different countries. And in that time, we would always take about 3 months during the summer, and we would do a month in Europe, a month in Asia, where I would go and get to visit Korea, and then a month back here in the US. And so that was a, a, a pretty amazing childhood. Um, and from my perspective of being an adoptee, it was even more interesting. It was, yeah, it was to say the least. There were times when I got to be a certain age, there were times when people would ask me if I was their maid. When I got to be 12 and older, they were thinking that I was their maid or my dad's Asian lover. Yeah, and that was interesting and difficult. Um, I remember always having to be much louder when I'm with them to point out and say mom and dad very loudly so that people knew that this is my mother and father, you know, um, especially when I was with my dad. I wanted people to know, that no, I'm not his Asian lover, and no, I'm not his, or their maid for that matter, Um, and there was one story where when we lived in Kuwait, and I was probably about 12 or 13, I think, and my mom and I were cleaning house, and so I had, a rag or a scarf on my head, and I was wearing, just, sweats and a t-shirt, I guess. And and we were sweeping, and one of my dad's coworkers came over, and he saw me, and he said to my dad, he said, "Oh, I didn't know you had a maid." And my dad said, "Oh no, that's my daughter." And the guy kind of chuckled, and then he winked and told my dad, he was like, "Okay, I get you. When you're done with your daughter, send her over my way." And so, yeah, so that, I mean, I heard everything. I didn't know what was the connotation behind it. All I knew, the feeling that I got was not a very, happy feeling at all. Um, So yeah, so it was, I mean, and my dad to this day won't admit to that story. He says that, yeah, that I'm making fun of it or that I'm making it up. I mean, so yeah, so it's some of my stories are they say that a lot of my parents, I think that a lot of the stories that I remember or my memories, they tell me that they're disconnected or they're not right. Um, And that makes it hard for me because I know and I feel that these things did happen, like one time in Kuwait when I was about 10, um, my dad, or no, I'm sorry, Egypt, when we were visiting Egypt, we were living in Kuwait, but we were visiting Egypt, and this guy came up and put a gun to my dad's head and was trying to come and grab me and wanted to take me. Um, and at that time, my dad immediately, told my mom to take me to the car and lock the doors. And so they did. Um, and my dad resolved it, and he was fine. But when I bring that story up, he just shuts it down. He says, "No, no, don't talk about that." It's like they always want to talk about, how good it was, and it was great. I had a great life. I really, you know, I get the feeling that they wish that I was more grateful. And Sorry. There's so much behind that word, grateful. I'm grateful that they got me out of that orphanage. But am I truly grateful that they took me out of Korea? That I don't know my culture, my heritage, my history. They always say that my dad and my mom used to always tell me, because I used to, when I was little, I used to always talk about my birth mother, as I say, my Oma. um, and when I was little, I would always tell them, because I would ask them about her and ask where she was. And they told me that she probably didn't want me because, or she probably couldn't have me because she was really poor. And so as a little child, you want to, you have this big dream. And I remember always thinking that I was going to go and find her and, give her all the money in the world and save her. That's what I wanted to do. At 5, because I was talking about her so much, they told me that she's probably dead. So I stopped talking about her. And I didn't talk about her for a really long time. I mean, yeah, I believed him. I thought, yeah, they're probably right. She's dead. But can I honestly say that? I don't know. Um, I've always had a connection with her. What child doesn't with their mother? When we moved back to the US, my parents and I, they got me naturalized. And I think I was about 5, I think. I was either, yeah, I'm not exactly sure. But um, I remember wearing this red and white, dress. It was definitely, an American flag dress. I was so excited to be naturalized. And so I remember standing up and doing the Pledge of Allegiance and everything and being extremely proud. And then when we were done, my mom and I, we walked out, and I asked her if I could go use the restroom. And so she waited for me outside, or out in the hallway, and I went in, and I guess I was in there for quite a while, she said, for probably about maybe 5 minutes. And so she decided to walk in. And as she walked in, I was, sitting there in front of the mirror staring at myself like this. And my mother looked at me and said, "What are you doing?" And I looked at her and I said, "I'm waiting for my eyes to change." Because I thought, an American, of course my eyes are going to change. They're going to be round. I'm going to look like my mom and dad now. And, you know, of course I wanted to celebrate that day. Um, that was a very, very hard conversation for my mother to have with me, to explain to me that I will never, you know, look like them. And I think that, you know, as time went on for me, I knew, and maybe at that moment, I decided to um, be as white as possible. Um, yeah, I believed that I was 100% white. My friends and I remember when, as a teenager, I was joking around with them and, you know, um, and they would say, well, you're Asian, or at that time, you're Oriental. And I would say, no, I'm not. I might look Asian on the outside, but I'm 100% white on the inside. Um, and I never fully understood that. I mean, my parents, they talk about white, I mean, my parents don't talk about white privilege, but, society talks about white privilege. And that they're able to go through life without having to worry about people judging them on their skin tone or their race or anything like that. And and for me, yeah, I got judged. People would point things out. They would say racist remarks. They would, but for me, it was just like, I didn't take it in. I was just like, you have no idea. You're an idiot. I'm white. Why can't you see that? I'm 100% white. And so and I believed that for a long time. I believed also that, there was no racism, you know? I was just like, no, there's no racism. I got over it. You get over it. You know, um, I never realized that I had such um, that I had feelings behind it, because I didn't accept it. My friends would joke around. They're like, "You're more white than we are," and I'm like, "Yeah, you're right." To me, that was a compliment. I was like, "All right, yeah, I am." Um, and so then there was, so then when after I had my son, my son is biracial. He's Asian and he's white. He's Korean and white. And I remember when I was pregnant with him, and my former mother-in-law asked me at the time and said, "Well, what do you want your baby to look like?" You know, and she's very, very liberal and very open, and really wanted me to start talking about this. And she said it brought tears to her eyes after what I told her, and what I said was that I want my baby to um, look, I want my baby to have blue eyes and black hair. And I want my baby to look more like his father and not me. So when he was born and he came out, he had blue eyes and he had red hair. And he did look like his dad. He didn't look much like me at all. And I remember holding him because they brought him up to me. And I remember holding him. And of course, I was, in tears and everything. And then they wheeled him away because I had a C-section. And so once I got to really spend some time with him and look at him, I remember being so heartbroken. I was so extremely heartbroken because I I honestly didn't want him to look like his dad. I wanted him to look like me. I wanted to have that connection. I wanted I wanted someone that looked like me, my family. And being that he was my first blood relative that I met, and him not looking like me was heartbreaking for me. But as time went on and he started developing, he started looking more and more like me. And my son has got such good insight. He one day, when when he was like 2, we were cuddled up in the bed together. And he comes up to me and he's like laying there looking at me. And he puts his hand on my face, his little hand. And he looks at me and he's like, "Mama," he goes, "you know what? You and I, we have the same eyes." I wanted to hear that so badly growing up. So yeah, so and then he proceeded to point out that we had the same hands and the same feet and the same smile and the same nose, and we do. um, and so yeah, it was really um, sorry. Um, to hear him say that and him not really understanding what he did to me, what he did for me, um, was a gift. I mean, he just and he understands now. I mean, he's 12 now. He gets it. He understands. Um, and he always talks about his Korean grandma. And he's like, so are we ever going to get to meet Korean grandma? You know, I always hated school when I was younger, always. And it's kind of funny that I'm a teacher, but I hated school when I was younger. It was always difficult. I didn't like, the name calling or anything like that. I didn't like what I was learning. I never really was engaged. Then I went to college, and um, and when I went back, it was it was an eye opener for me. It was huge. So there was this class that I took, and um, I don't remember the name of the class, but it was essentially about you know identity, and um, and with identity and American history and everything. And they started talking about racism and talking about all of these different things that I had, totally shunned and said, no, that's not true. It doesn't, no, no way. I'm embarrassed to say it, but this was when I was like 32, you know, and it was like a whole new chapter of my life because I started noticing things. I started noticing things in my life, in advertisement, in just everywhere I looked. And it was like Pandora's box was opened. My dad, we were at the house and we were watching a movie. And by this time, I'm a single mom now. And we watched this movie, and it was about a black family back in the 1960s, and having to be on welfare and having to hide their items away from the social worker because the social worker, if they saw them, would want more money or want or not money, sorry, would take their assistance away. And so I really enjoyed the movie. I thought it was a fantastic movie. And my dad afterwards asked me and said, "So, Young, what can you relate to that?" And I was like, "Relate to what? What do you mean?" And he goes, "Well, being a single mom and having a kid and all that." Oh, and the mother in the movie had 6 children. And I was like, "I'm not quite sure what you're trying to ask me, Dad." And um, he was like, "Well, a mother struggling and everything, and um, you talk about how hard it is for you to struggle and things like that, and being a person of being a person of color and everything, So can you relate?" And I was like, "Yeah, I can relate to some extent, And so we kind of had a dialogue, and I thought, okay, at least he's open to this dialogue, right? And then when I started talking about um, jobs and the job market and how hard it is for people of color to be able to get jobs sometimes, my dad, he got so upset and he looked at me and he said, "Younghwa, I want you to know this, and you know this for a fact. You Orientals make more money in this state or in this country than any other country." And I didn't even know where to begin. I was just like shocked. And so I asked him, I said, I was like, "Okay, first of all, Dad, don't call me Oriental because I'm not. I'm not an object." And he was like, "Oh, we're just talking about semantics now." And I was like, "No, it's not semantics. It's a fact, actually." And then my aunt, who was there as well, she was like, "Well, I'm gonna go get the dictionary." And I'm like, "Okay, let's just keep it real simple, guys, and why not just out of respect for me and me being a part of this family, just not call me that, you know? I'm not an object, I'm not your object, Dad, and, you know, why I mean, of all things, you want people to think that I'm your object? That's not okay, you know? And he got really upset, and, and he was like, "If I wanna call you Oriental, I'm gonna call you Oriental, and that's okay." And I was like, "No, it's not okay, and I'm done." And, I, packed up my stuff and grabbed Joshua and got in my car and drove home. I was like, "Nope, the visit is done." And from that day on, it's been a bit tenuous because my dad always had this vision of me, being this quiet, little timid girl. He didn't wanna say anything, who looked up to her daddy, you know? I mean, he was my savior, he saved me. So that was I think that when he saw that I was gonna speak up and really speak my mind now, he had a hard time with that. So there I am with this whole new identity and thinking, "Okay, I've opened up Pandora's box. What now?" And thinking, "Do I really want Pandora's box open?" Maybe if I just close it back up again and act like it never happened, I can continue the life that I've continued. And I talked about it with friends. I, really had to process that whole thing. And I thought, you know what? No, there's no way that I can discard it. The blinders are off. Pandora's box is open, and I'm going to embrace it. And I'm going to take this on and try and be, a proud Korean woman, and be proud of being in my own skin, because I think there were so many times where I didn't want to be in my own skin that I would look in the mirror and be like, that's the wrong face. I have this dream, this reoccurring dream that I'm going to go back to Korea and I'm going to lose my passport and they're going to tell me that I have to stay. And I'm just like, "No, I don't want to stay," and it feels as I'm saying it right now, it feels horrible that I'd say that because I really desperately want that connection, with Korea, but at the same time, it's like, I don't. I don't wanna be I guess I don't wanna be lost there, and I don't know, Joshua wants to go back. Joshua wants to go there, and I would love to go back and visit, but I do have this huge fear that I'm gonna be stuck there. I'm not gonna know the culture. I'm not gonna know anything. Essentially, in my mind, I guess to some extent, I'm a white woman who's gonna be stuck there, Oh, heaven forbid, So, but also at the same time, it's like, okay, that's another, point where I have to really work on and look at it and say, okay, what can I learn from this? How can I accept this? Um, and it's interesting because people ask me all the time, "Oh, um, you know, uh, how was your identity growing up?" Like just my white friends in general, when they find out I'm adopted, they're like, "Oh, that must have been hard for you. How was your identity? Did you feel uncomfortable? Did you feel out of place? Did you?" And it's like, "Yeah, all of the above."